Hello, welcome to Legislative Report. I'm State Representative Kate Harper of the 61st District in Montgomery County. One of my responsibilities in Harrisburg is to chair the House Local Government Committee. We recently held a hearing on a bill that would prevent municipalities from enacting zoning or housing ordinances that discriminate against college students. Some communities have ordinances and regulations that limit renting to college students in order to address concerns with parking, noise levels, or code violations that might come from dense developments of college tenants. The bill discussed at this hearing would preempt those municipal ordinances or any that prohibits the occupation of a rental property based on a person's student or matriculation status or the number of unrelated people sharing one unit. On today's program, I'd like to share portions of the committee hearing with you. We have a bill in our committee that is prime sponsored by Representative Sue Helm from Dauphin and Lebanon counties that deals with zoning in college towns. What we thought we'd do is come out and hold a hearing, to hear both sides of the issue in a college town, because we thought that it would help us get a better perspective on the representative's bill.
I am State Representative Sue Helm, and I serve the 104th District, which includes parts of Dauphin and Lebanon counties. I would like to thank the committee for scheduling this hearing on what we feel is an important piece of legislation that would have a significant and positive impact on those attending colleges and universities in Pennsylvania, also the owners of student housing properties, along with the communities in which the schools are located. I am pleased to be able to sponsor House Bill 809 and provide some details on what we are trying to accomplish with the legislation. Our goal is to end the possibility of there being any discrimination against students when they are looking for a place to live while attending classes in colleges, communities across the Commonwealth. Students should not be discriminated against simply because they are students. Many of them are veterans or married and are good neighbors that do not cause problems. We believe there should be no blanket prohibition or undue regulation in any residential zone. House Bill 809 would do that by preempting any municipal ordinance that prohibits the occupation of a housing unit by students or unrelated persons who are living together. The legislation specifically says any local regulation that prohibits the occupation of a housing unit based on an individual's matriculation status would be preempted. Matriculation status is defined in our proposal as the state of being enrolled in a post-secondary educational institution, including reasonable periods of time before and between admission to a college or university. Under the bill, the occupation of a housing unit by students or unrelated persons would be based on several factors. There is reasonable and sufficient on-street and off-street parking for the number of vehicles registered to or driven by the occupants of a housing unit. That no more than 2 persons can occupy each bedroom of the housing unit. And that the housing unit does not have any unique health and safety concerns or unresolved code violations. Municipalities typically control student housing through zoning ordinance. We believe it is entirely within reason for them to enact and enforce rules to regulate such things as parking, noise levels, health and safety concerns, or code violations. However, we also believe it is unfair and unreasonable to attempt to regulate these issues by singling out students or unrelated persons living together based on the incorrect assumption made by some municipalities that they will be problem citizens and undesirable neighbors who will have a negative impact on the community and its quality of life. Thank you, Chairman Harper, Chairman Freeman, and committee members. That concludes my remarks, and if there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer them now.
I understand the point and what you're trying to do about not discriminating against people based on their matriculation status, students. But the thing I was surprised at in the language of the bill is that there's also a prohibition based on the number of unrelated individuals sharing a dwelling unit. That type of a classification exists in communities that aren't that aren't college towns, because otherwise, as Representative Santora pointed out, you could have 10 people living in a single-family dwelling. Maybe a generation ago, they might have been 2 parents and 8 kids, but that's pretty rare these days. Why did you put that section into the bill?
Well, in addition to students, in talking to this, we didn't want to just single out students again, and we don't want to discriminate against students, but that was, a lot of people brought that subject up too, so we added it to the bill, and we're open to hear what people have to say about it, but we thought it was a good idea to put it in.
We will hear from Scott Zeloff, a Lower Merion Township Commissioner, which also has college town issues, and had some litigation resulting from the college town issues.
Lower Merion Township strongly opposes this legislation, and I'd like to tell you why. Lower Merion's a first-ring suburb of Philadelphia and is among the largest townships by population in Pennsylvania. We're home to all or portions of 5 very fine institutions of higher learning: Bryn Mawr College, Harcum College, Haverford College, Rosemont College, St. Joseph's University, and additionally Villanova University is in Radnor Township on the border with Lower Merion. Off-campus student-occupied homes are and have been a significant problem in our community. This occurs primarily when colleges fail to provide on-campus housing for all of their students. The primary example in our township is Villanova. As I understand the history, Villanova evolved from primarily a commuter school to a university with a larger student body, and this transition appeared to occur slowly until Villanova became the national basketball champions in 1985. Villanova didn't have enough on-campus housing for many of the students coming in from other areas of the country at that time, and thus students started living in rental properties in nearby communities. By 1988, the South Ardmore and South Bryn Mawr sections of Lower Merion had some blocks with more than half of the homes occupied by students. These are high-density neighborhoods with many twins and row homes. Investors were purchasing family-occupied homes and converting them into student rentals. The trend accelerated because families then moved away due to the negative impact of the student-occupied rental properties. The student-occupied homes completely changed those neighborhoods. The neighborhoods went from quiet and family-occupied to neighborhoods primarily occupied by students. These off-campus student homes essentially became unsupervised dormitories with no college oversight on student behavior. Students were walking the streets well past midnight, disturbing neighbors many nights a week. Students would leave the nearby bars at closing time and loudly walk the neighborhoods to attend after-hours parties, disturbing the peace and quiet of the community. Citations were issued for disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, underage drinking, and public urination. Adding to the neighborhood disruption, landlords were able to charge significantly higher rents. These resulted in too many students living in many of these homes in order to make the rents affordable. So 25 years ago, in 1989, Lower Merion Township amended the zoning code to create a use classification for student houses and imposing regulations on that use. Included in the code is a requirement that student residents be physically separated from one another, that the residents have a minimum size, that the residence can be occupied by no more than 3 unrelated persons, and that off-street parking be provided. Our ordinance has been challenged in the Pennsylvania courts through the land use appeal process, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court found our ordinance to be valid. Our ordinance has been challenged in the federal courts as a violation of student civil rights. The challenge was denied, thus upholding our ordinance. Similar ordinances have become part of the zoning fabric in many communities, confronted with the negative impact of student-occupied houses, and I'm sure that will be explained by the Borough of Westchester and others testifying today. Since the enactment of the student housing ordinance, there has been a significant reduction in the number of houses occupied by students. The result has been a preservation of the residential character of the affected neighborhoods. These regulations have allowed many of the residential Many of the homes in these neighborhoods to revert back to family occupation and have generally prevented additional homes from being occupied by students. The inability of the township to regulate student housing through the enactment of reasonable and appropriate measures would have resulted in the student takeover of several residential neighborhoods. Although there has been about a 40% reduction in the number of student homes since our ordinance was adopted 25 years ago, many of the problems I described continue today with student-occupied homes. There's still disruption, there's still noise, litter, disorderly conduct, and public urination violations. We continue to experience problems with overcrowding in student-occupied homes. Enforcement of the existing occupancy limits is difficult. The ability to distinguish a visitor staying overnight from a permanent resident is a difficult burden. According to our zoning officer, it requires many hours of investigation, requires an administrative search warrant in order to verify occupancy, and by the time all the required documentation is obtained, to properly document the illegal occupancy, and a local DJ hearing date is scheduled, the school year is often coming to an end. Unless completed in the current school year, the process begins again. Once we're able to establish a code violation, it can take 60 to 90 days to get a hearing with the district justice. To bring it forward, to Villanova's great credit, they are planning and have recently received approval to add additional on-campus student dormitories. But the transition that occurred at Villanova 25 years ago appears to be occurring recently with St. Joseph's. House Bill 809 would restrict the ability of a community to limit overcrowding in housing occupied by students. House Bill 809's allowance to regulate based on the number of vehicles registered to or driven by the occupants at a dwelling is not a viable solution. It's very difficult for municipal officials to verify the occupancy of a dwelling unit. And more importantly, student-operated vehicles are typically registered to one or more of their parents at their home address, often not in state. I want to point out that this bill affects more than just off-campus student housing. The legislation effectively eliminates the concept of single-family housing as we know it and is instituted throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It prohibits the regulation of residences based on the number of unrelated persons occupying the property. The proposed regulation can only be based on the number of occupants, 2 per bedroom, and the number of vehicles registered to or driven by occupants. And it's next to impossible for a municipality to determine the number of occupants of a building, let alone the names of those individuals. I've provided for committee members the copies of a resolution unanimously adopted by the Lower Merion Township Commissioners last Wednesday. This resolution urges you to reject this bill. During the discussions of the resolution, our board also objected to any state-level legislation that preempts a local community's ability to regulate land use. The local elected officials are in the best position to understand the impact of land use on their community, and they understand the regulations that best meet community needs. The level of local land use regulation cannot be applied with a broad brush at the state level. This is especially true in Pennsylvania with the rural, suburban, and urban communities that are in our state. Our recommendation is to leave the land use decisions to the local elected officials that know what works best. The proposed legislation, if enacted, would have a devastating effect on Lower Merion Township. We believe it would also have a devastating impact on many other municipalities across Pennsylvania. Our student housing ordinance is tried and true. It's serving us well. So Lower Merion Township strongly opposes this preemption of local zoning, and we encourage the local government committee to reject House Bill 809. Thank you.
The question I had was, does your, I actually read the case involving Lower Merion in preparation for this hearing. And I believe the testimony in the case was you had about 175 college rental units, and your current testimony is 84. The court ruled that you didn't exclude students as residents of Lower Merion Township, and so that your ordinance was lawful. But at the same time, I'm trying to balance the fact that these universities can be significant employment centers and offer significant advantages to a local government, you know, in terms of quality of life for people taking courses and things like that. So I'm wondering whether you feel that the Lower Merion Ordinance correctly balances the universities and colleges are good things to have with, but we don't want you living next door. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think, Madam Chairman, it does provide the balance that's appropriate, because we value greatly our institutions. We have colleges, we have many schools, independent as well as public. We have hospitals. We have 13% of our property in Lower Merion Township is institutional property, so that's very important for the character of our community. But and certainly universities provide employment and they help the local businesses. But we also have to have a balance with the impact on the quality of life of the communities, all the neighborhoods and communities in the township. And so I think we've achieved that. Although, as I pointed out, we still have challenges and still have significant, the challenges require a lot of police presence at times. So we have to continually respond to the impact of some student behavior, certainly not all, but some student behavior on the quality of life in those primarily two parts of the township where they currently live. But we have done so with a significant reduction in the number of student homes in these past 25 years.
Okay, so, and your local ordinance basically works by limiting the number of unrelated individuals who can reside in a dwelling.
Yes.
And by having a separation factor, you have to be so many feet away from the next piece of student housing.
That's the core of the ordinance, is the separation requirement.
Many of the issues that we are discussing today are issues that not only impact the business of our rental housing providers, but they impact their ability to provide rental housing to students and non-students alike. PROA is a trade association comprised of 25 local associations across the Commonwealth. We represent approximately 10,000 small business owners in every community in Pennsylvania. Many of our members are small mom-and-pop businesses with less than 10 rental units, many of them working on a very small cash flow margin. Although universities and colleges have existed in many municipalities throughout Pennsylvania for decades, being in harmony with the residents, plus being a major economic factor to the municipality, there is a change in the acceptance and regards for the students. Now, we do understand that municipal officials are under pressure to respond to citizens' complaint regarding noise, trash, and quality of life concerns. However, we believe that the appropriate remedies should be in the form of noise ordinances, trash ordinances, or other specific remedies that address the specific complaint. Many municipalities currently have such ordinances in place. We support these ordinances and their enforcement. Our concern is the ordinances that discriminate against and punish rental housing providers that rent units to students. Their objective seems to be to reduce the number of students living in their community or to segregate them to specific areas in the community. In the real estate world, this is termed redlining, and it's an illegal activity. Some municipalities have crafted ordinances that discriminate against students based on the length of their lease term, in defining what is a full-time student, limits on the number of unrelated persons living in a unit, limiting housing as student-only or no students, as well as where the specific housing may be located. Why should a couple be required to move from their rental home because their status to or from student has changed? With the return of troops, we are seeing more and more of these type situations. We feel that we need to clarify what the term student means. Is it based on age, matriculation in the college or university, number of credits being pursued, work status, or another factor? Each municipality has a different definition or stereotype of a student. Some of these ordinances have been disputed at the local district magistrates level by rental housing providers and tenants alike. However, they have not resulted in a clear set of rules or guidelines for all to play by. We feel that the Commonwealth needs to adopt some type of uniform standard to address the needs of student housing in reference to these ordinances. Economic harm is being done to rental housing providers and tenants alike. All these issues factor into why we feel that a change in the law is needed to protect the integrity of renting legally across the Commonwealth and to protect the tenants that we provide housing for. Telling people where they may or may not live based on anything other than their ability to afford the rent or Megan's Law should not be the function of rental housing providers. Tenants should not be treated as a second-class citizen, for they are a vital part of our economic structure. An answer to this is to adopt the legislation that makes student a person matriculated in an institution of higher learning, free from arbitrary boundaries in which they reside.
The next panel is going to be led by Mayor Carolyn Committa from Westchester. Thank you, Westchester, for having us, hosting us this morning.
Welcome, each of our members of the local government committee to the Borough of Westchester, and also each of the residents and people who are here today. I know not everyone will have an opportunity to speak in opposition to this bill or in support. But what I wanted to do was thank everyone who came out today in opposition to this proposed bill, and I would like to ask if you would stand and show who is here in opposition to this bill today.
Yeah, that would be helpful so that we don't have to run the hearing too late. So all the people who are standing now, and it looks to me like 40% of the audience, maybe more, 60% of the audience, okay? What? Yeah, about 60% of the audience is standing and they are opposed to the bill. Thank you, Mayor Committa. You can all sit down and that's noted in the record.
I do want to make a comment for my colleague who attended the Pennsylvania Mayors Association this past weekend. The PA Mayors Association has gone on record in opposing this legislation, so we'd like the record to show that as well. I also would like to note that Borough Council, Westchester Borough Council, unanimously opposes this legislation and urges you to reject House Bill 809. Council will pass a resolution in August to that effect. Basically, what we have done is listed on this first slide the impacts of unregulated high-density student housing to our borough and, we believe, to any university community in the state. House Bill 809 imposes a disparate impact on communities hosting universities, as you've heard. Negatively impacts a community's quality of life, destabilizes neighborhoods and communities, negatively impacts community safety, removes local zoning control, degrades a community's health and welfare, and undoes cooperative university and community efforts. Essentially, House Bill 809, as we said, negatively impacts community safety. And as we know, as elected officials, we have all sworn to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens we serve. And it is very clear that this bill would undermine our ability to protect our students as well as our non-student residents. You see our southwest neighborhood, which is single-family detached residential, compared to the southeast student rental housing, which we call our university neighborhood. You will see the calls for service in those two neighborhoods. So you have a predominantly single-family detached with some students living on each block, compared to the southeast student rental neighborhood, which is about 75 to 90% students on each student housing on each block. If you look for the, if you look at the Part 1 and Part 2 and miscellaneous calls for service in the primarily family neighborhood in January through June in 2015, you see we had a total of 61 calls. If you look at the number of calls in the southeast student rental neighborhood, January through June of this year, there were 1,111 calls. Now, although I know students are not a protected class, in my opinion, it is our responsibility as adults and a university community to protect our students as well as we protect all of our residents. And part of the way we do that is to regulate their housing so that the housing can be as safe as possible and the neighborhoods can be as safe and as livable as possible. House Bill 809 undoes cooperative university and community efforts. We have been working so diligently and so successfully for over a decade, 4 decades now, but significantly for over a decade, to bring our students, our university staff, and our borough residents, business owners, elected officials, law enforcement officials, and rental property owners together to find ways to improve the quality of life in our borough. Our rental property owners are our friends. They have helped us improve how we inspect our rental properties, how to make them safer. We do not have an adversarial relationship with our rental property owners. We are partners. In fact, the mission of the Westchester Police Department is to protect and serve our diverse communities by forging collaborative relationships, and this is exactly what we're doing. I urge you to reject House Bill 809. We have many, many issues that we all need to devote our time and energy to. We have our municipal pension crisis. We have the catastrophic effects of climate change. Let's come together and deal with those. We're doing fine working together in our communities to protect our students and all of our residents. Please help us. And again, thank you for being here today.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's program. I'm State Representative Kate Harper. If you need assistance with any state government matter, feel free to contact me at my local office. The address and number will be shown in just a moment. Thanks for watching. Please join me again for Legislative Report.